Hello, everyone, and welcome to London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development Rethinking Capitalism series. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ioannis Ioannou, and I'm an Associate Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at London Business School. I would first like to thank the Wheeler Institute for hosting us today. With the generous support of Tony and Maureen Wheeler, the founders of Lonely Planet, LBS has established a research institute that focuses on the role of business in addressing social and economic challenges in emerging, frontier, and low-income countries. But in addition to funding research and informing learning, the Wheeler Institute organizes public talks and events. This evening's event is the second of the Wheeler Institute public talks under the theme of Rethinking Capitalism. I'm therefore thrilled to welcome a distinguished professor, but also a mentor and a friend of mine to today's webinar, Professor Rebecca Henderson. Now, Rebecca is definitely someone that needs no introductions, but I'll make some anyway. Rebecca is the John and Natty McArthur University Professor at Harvard University, where she has a joint appointment at the Harvard Business School in the General Management and Strategy Unit. She's a fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and at HBS, Rebecca teaches an award-winning MBA class titled Reimagining Capitalism. Today, Rebecca will be speaking to us about what I think at least truly courageous ideas in her recently published book that's titled Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. We have asked Rebecca to make some opening remarks before our fireside chat. So Rebecca, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us today to share your ideas and insights, indeed, for a world in true fire. Thank you. Over to you.
Yanni, thank you very much. I'm honored and delighted to be here, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk about my new book. I've been asked to summarize it in 10 minutes. So that's 28 1.5-hour sessions when I teach it, or more than 300 pages in the book, all of them exciting and dynamic. But let me see if I can give you the basic idea. Capitalism is broken. It is not working as it's supposed to. We have half the world's population saying that capitalism is not working for them. 70% of the US population saying the system is rigged against them. In the US, the bottom 50% haven't had a pay raise in approximately 20 years, and inequality is significantly increasing everywhere else in the world. Social mobility is falling. More and more people fear that their children will not have a better life than they do. We are seeing a massive crisis of exclusion. All across the world, people with black skins or brown skins, or who are simply different from the ruling majority, are protesting that they are excluded, that they are abused. We have a major environmental problem. The world is on fire. When I wrote the book, California and Australia were literally burning. And there is a significant risk of catastrophic climate change, submerging the world's major coastal cities, destabilizing agriculture, sending hundreds of millions of people north in search of food and work. Don't get me wrong. I am a huge fan of capitalism. I teach at the London Business School. I think capitalism is one of the greatest inventions of the human race, an unparalleled source of innovation and productivity and opportunity. But it only works when the free market is balanced by free politics and a strong civil society. My reading of the literature in history and development economics and political science is overwhelmingly that a stable, prosperous society, a free society, requires 3 legs. Yes, the free market, but also a capable, transparent, democratically accountable government, and a strong civil society, a voice for labor, independent judiciary, and a strong free media. I think we have forgotten this in the West. Over the last 20, 30 years, we got so rich and so prosperous, And it was so easy to say, government's the problem, drown it in the bathtub. And I see where that's coming from. I have 25 years of major board experience. I understand that regulations are sometimes a nuisance and that paying taxes is not always fun, but we need the free market to be balanced by government. We need public goods. We need a strong social net, safety net, strong education and health system to ensure that there's real freedom of opportunity. We need decent labor legislation so that the minimum wage is a living wage, so that there are decent benefits like paid sick days off. We need a strong government to regulate pollution. If you can throw greenhouse gases out the window for free, why not? It's a great way to maximize returns. We need a capitalism that's run by the rules, in which the large firms don't set the rules in their own favor and keep out entrepreneurial firms or ensure that there's a barrier to entry in their industry. We need a government that's not flooded with money, that reflects the will of the entire population, not just those with resources. So if that's where we need to go, how do we get there? Well, the easy answer is to say we need a massive political and social movement to rebuild democracy everywhere. One of the scariest statistics I came across in my work is that only about 25% of people under 30 believe that democracy is essential. Why do they say that? They say that because they look at the system they're in and they say, well, this isn't working for me, let's try something new. Half of millennials say, we don't want capitalism, we want socialism. Why are they saying that? I think they mean they want decent healthcare, but sometimes they seem to mean they want state ownership of the means of production. So how do we fix things in a world in which governments are so broken? First, massive social and political movement to rebuild democracy, as I said. But the beating heart of my book is the idea that business has an important role to play in rebalancing capitalism. Now, I know this is a bit of a crazy idea. When I was trying to sell my book to one of the major publishers in New York, the editor looked at me and said, Rebecca, business saves the world. Don't you read the papers? And believe me, I know a great deal about what business has done to destabilize the system we're in and what they continue to do that is perhaps not in the best interests of the entire society. But I think there is hope. There are 5 steps business can take. The first is to become purpose-driven. Not in the sense of throwing investors out the window. As I said, I serve on major corporate boards. I'm a big fan of giving investors a decent return. But I think it's time to realize that making money and giving investors a decent return is a means to an end and not the end in itself. The end in itself is building a healthy and thriving society. Business needs to relearn that. It's an old idea. We always used to have a social contract between business, government, and labor and ordinary people. Business was part of the mix. Yet starting, you name it, sometime in the 70s, we told business just stick your head down and maximize shareholder value. Even if the world starts falling apart around you, even if the easiest way to maximize shareholder value is to trash the planet, push wages down to the bottom, and corrupt your local legislator. So we need to rethink the purpose of the firm. Secondly, we need to start to build business models that not only create profits, but also address some of the major social and environmental problems we face. My colleague Michael Porter calls this creating shared value, the classic win-win, and I can feel your skepticism. It's not everywhere, it's not for everyone, but in many industries, we are seeing firms build billion-dollar businesses on the basis of the idea that you can do both. The most successful IPO of the last 20 years was a soybean burger company trying to revolutionize the meat industry, a major source of emissions and of poor health. We've seen billion-dollar businesses in solar and wind. Renewable energy in many parts of the world is now cheaper than fossil fuels, even unsubsidized. Someone like Elon Musk has revolutionized the entire car business by doing what he thought was right. All kinds of issues with Mr. Musk, but he is certainly driving transformation and has built one of the most valuable car companies in the world at the same time. So step one, develop a purpose. Step two, create shared value. Step three, whoops. If I do the right thing as a firm, that's great. I can make money. The fact that I'm purpose-driven mobilizes my employees. I might be running a high-road employment system, much more productive, much more innovative. Seems good, but whoops, it's not enough. Even if every firm on the planet pursued those opportunities that can return money and do the right thing, we're not going to solve our problems. Solving inequality requires really investing in education and health and inclusion and wage legislation to make sure the playing field is level. Solving the environmental problems require, redoing the transportation, food systems, rebuilding cities, retrofitting every house on the planet. Massive transformation. It's going to require government involvement. So what can we do? What can we do about problems that we want to address, but are not, there's no good business model as a business owner? 3 ideas. First, get together, cooperate. Particularly in the food industry, we're seeing things like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, the Alliance to Reduce the Purchase of Conventionally Grown Soya and Beef from the Amazon. In the apparel industry, we're seeing the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. There are hundreds of these coalitions. What they're trying to do is solve a problem that is in the interest of everyone in the industry. In apparel, no major Western brand wants to be associated with child labor or environmental problems or abuse in its supply chain. None of them alone can afford to move because it's expensive and complicated. But if every brand moves together, then they can make doing the right thing pre-competitive. The industry benefits, consumers benefit, the supply chain benefits, check. The only problem is that while cooperation is super important and moves entire industries in the right direction, it tends to be unstable. So step 4 is, okay, we agreed to cooperate, but there's, Fred and Mary over here, they're not pulling their weight, they're not interested, they are what the economists would call defecting. So how do we make sure everyone cooperates to do the right things? Easy. 2 final ideas. 1, we rewire finance. Let me just leave that, but we got to rewire the capital markets if this is going to work. And last but not least, we fix the democracy. We address the problems with our civil society. I believe that business has a strong economic interest in rebuilding a balanced capitalism, and that both now and historically, they have been willing to exercise that interest. We are seeing hundreds of firms working with state and local government to enact regulations and policies that benefit the entire society. Why? Because it's good for business as well. So we can reimagine capitalism. We must. Over to you, Yanni.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. As you said, 300 exciting pages of ideas, and I'll do my best in the time that we have today to cover as many of them as we can. So I would like to ask you as we go along to unpack some of those very important issues for us. Now, allow me to start with a quote from your book, which I really love. You said, managers view issues such as climate change, inequality, and institutional collapse as externalities best left to governments and civil society. And then you argue that as a result, we have created a system in which many of the world's companies believe that it is their moral duty to do nothing for the public good. That's a very strong statement, I think, but also a statement that gives us sort of a sense of the extent of the challenge here. So I would like to ask you, Rebecca, to sort of unpack for us, what are those elements of the system that have these negative implications on companies to feel that they should not do anything about public goods? And in other words, where should we start when we talk about fixing the system? And a bit of a provocative question, are you optimistic that the system, capitalism, can fix itself?
Oh, no fair. That's two questions. Let me start with the first. Where should we start? So suppose you're working for a firm that's never thought about these issues. It's head down, maximize shareholder value the whole way. Where do you start? First, you start with the short-termism problem. Many managers have talked themselves into believing that they will not survive unless they maximize short-term quarterly earnings right here, right now. Let's be clear, they have a point. Missing short-term quarterly earnings is not a good thing. Investors tend to think it means that you don't know what you're doing. And sometimes it does. So the issue is, how do we get firms to think longer term? Two ways. First, we get them to begin to think longer term. You'd be surprised by how many firms are not routinely running 3 or 4 or 5 year strategic plans. They really are running quarter to quarter. And my belief is that's just bad for business. So start to look out, start to recognize the opportunities. Second step, learn to talk about that to investors. It is not true that investors are routinely myopically short term. If they were, that would provide an incredible opportunity for investors who are willing to focus on the long term. They just clean up. If you can give a good story to an investor, and if you can support it with metrics and milestones, you can get the money you want. Think of Amazon, no money for, what was it, 7 years and hundreds of millions in losses? Think of pharmaceutical companies, billions of dollars in long-term R&D that doesn't pay off for 10 years. Investors are fine with that. Why? Because they understand it. I had a friend once who was the chief technology officer at a major company whose name you know, whose sales had been falling for 15 years. And she said, Rebecca, the market won't let me do long-term stuff. And I'm like, Sarah, your sales have been falling for 15 years. You know, it's all about making the business case. So short-termism is the first problem. Second problem is many managers, I think, don't fully understand the law. They genuinely believe that they have a legal duty to maximize shareholder value right here, right now. Under American law, and we could talk about details in other parts of the world, but under American law, that's only really true when, and I'm going to get a bit technical, Revlon and Unicol duties are invoked. There are these specific circumstances when a firm is up for sale, when you've got to maximize shareholder value. The rest of the time, care, candor, and loyalty. Build a great enterprise. That's your legal duty. So I think so much of the short-term value maximization focus is a creature of habit and of the fact that, you know, people are paid that way. But we can back off that. That can be done. We can back off.
So Rebecca, in your book, you actually argue for the role of corporate purpose. So I guess the natural next question, given that you just highlighted this idea of shareholder value maximization, right? And often people cast these two views as antithetical or in conflict with each other. So I guess, and also because corporate purpose has a different definition for every person that uses it, basically. So could you share with us what is corporate purpose in your view, and how do you see this transition happening, or if you want the link between corporate purpose and shareholder value? Is shareholder value a byproduct of purpose? Is purpose something that, you know, some would argue that companies use purpose when they're not doing well financially? So how do you see that these two conceptually and practically linked, the shareholder value and the corporate purpose idea?
Imagine a world in which we had a perfectly transparent, well-run government that was setting the rules of the capitalist game, so that if I maximize shareholder value, the whole society would be better off. This is a world in which there's strong education and healthcare, there's really good labor legislation, so no one is going to be pushed down below the minimum wage. We've got environmental regulation that sets a carbon price. We have unions or a voice for labor that's negotiating with powerful companies so that labor is getting a decent return. We've got a well-enforced antitrust law, so firms are, busy competing with each other. In short, it's Denmark, okay? In such a world, I don't think there's that much conflict between shareholder value and purpose. There will be occasional conflicts. There'll always be the temptation to try and warp the rules in your own favor, always be a temptation to push a little hard. But in essence, the problem we face is not shareholder value is a problem. It's that the rest of the society is sort of kind of crumbled. Now, we can talk more about why that is. Partly it's the direct result of how businesses behaved. But if you could get that balance right, there wouldn't be the conflict. So what I'm suggesting in my book is right now, maximizing shareholder value in the long term, and here comes the weasel word, collectively. That is, if you were thinking about the well-being of the entire private sector, no conflict between having a purpose, which means rebuilding the society, focusing on the democracy, all the things I talked about. Now, you're going to say, well, that's nice, but I'm just a firm. And right for me right now, I can see all these great things I could do, but excuse me, I have to make a living. To which there are two replies. One is, that's the reality of where we are. That's why I talk about cooperation. That's why I talk about how having a purpose increases productivity and creativity. So push that boundary as hard as you can. Another potential reply is, we'll change the rules that govern corporations. Let's tell companies that it's okay to make a little less money if they fulfill social purpose. That's a huge debate on its own. Let me just say that I think it might be helpful, and that for firms that are already moving in this direction, adopting, say, a B corporate status, if you can, that says, my goal is to change the world. If you're going to invest money in me, you should know that about me, and here are the metrics I'm going to use. I think that's a great way to go. But I do not think we should turn to every corporation on the planet and say, hey, your purpose is to do good. Don't worry about these pesky shareholders. I think that would be a mistake. I'm a Harvard Business School professor. I think focusing on investment returns is important. So there's some kind of middle ground here, with the end state being, let's fix the rules so that this enormous conflict isn't as strong.
I think, Rebecca, in the current times, we would really, really have to leave our imagination run wild to imagine a world where the rules actually work. But I totally understand your point that in such a world, it would indeed be, a reconciliation, if you like, of the shareholder value and the purpose idea. Now, if I'm reading your argument correctly, then you're saying, well, we don't live in that utopian world, perhaps, but at the same time, that does not mean we cannot contribute towards getting into that world and, as you said, fixing the rules of the game. However, here's my other question. If it's so obvious then, right, why aren't companies doing it already? And I would use here another of my favorite quotes from your book, and of course we all know you were the Eastman Kodak professor at MIT for some time, so I think that directly relates to that. You write in your book that the key to this puzzle, I believe, is to realize that the embrace of shared value is first and foremost an innovation. And precisely an architectural innovation. Architectural innovations change the relationship between the components of a system, the system's architecture, without changing the components in themselves. Could you unpack that for us a little bit? How do you think that these ideas of architectural innovation link to the firm's ability to, or disability sometimes, to adjust to purpose and to this different world post shareholder value, perhaps?
We need to build a just and sustainable world. I think we can do that and make a great deal of money, and there's a lot of opportunity. But it is a shift. Doing that is going to require completely rethinking how we do a whole range of industries. Meat would be one. We think that meat is produced by big animals that bellow and walk around on legs. No. Meat could be produced in a petri dish. It would be exactly the same physically. It's being done now. That's a completely different structure for the food industry. Electric vehicles. Sounds easy, just take out the internal combustion engine, stick an electrical engine instead. Well, wait a moment. What about autonomous vehicles? What about controlling all the cars in a city so we manage the traffic? Moving to electric, what about using them as batteries overnight as storage for our renewable grid? This transition is a massive transition requiring real change. That's what I call architectural innovation. When it's no longer enough to simply assume that all you need to do is take the world for granted and just work on fixing your bit. An architectural innovation is when everything is shifting, and it's scary as heck. Firms faced with those kinds of transitions tend to have three responses. One, it's not happening. We have very strong mechanisms of denial and delay. All of us don't want to work most of us don't want to work too hard. We don't want to think that everything we know is shifting. Second problem, it's not going to make us any money. Often a seriously knee-jerk response, completely missing the point. And last but not least, okay, maybe it's happening, maybe it'll make some money, but you know, I am really busy and I have the wrong people. This is why purpose is so important. Because when you're focused on a greater goal, you have the energy and the creativity and the relationship with your employees necessary to get through the transition. So yes, not easy, not a walk in the park, absolutely possible. But that's why it's slow. It's, I mean, Kodak went bankrupt. They couldn't understand the transition to digital. I wrote the book because I don't want us to go bankrupt.
I think, Rebecca, I think we're on the same page, because I often refer to sustainability not only as a disruption, but in fact, the mother of all disruptions. Because in a sense, a lot of companies out there are lacking the knowledge, the skills, and of course, the experience necessary. And as much as many people don't like to hear this, what's the outcome of every disruption? A certain percentage of companies are going to be able to adapt. And the other ones, as you mentioned, they're going to be replaced by the Teslas of the world, the Impossible Foods of the world, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts if you think that the disruption lens also is an interesting way of looking at this. But let me pose a double question as well, linked to that, because we also know that typically the financial markets often have trouble actually evaluating or understanding disruption themselves. So some would argue that, you know, can we really count on financial markets to support business through this transition, given that they themselves might not understand it? Or another argument these days is that they are greenwashing themselves. They attach ESG labels on funds and so on. So can we count on true support and engagement of the financial community with companies in order to achieve this transition?
We can count on the full support of a portion of the financial community. I would say about a third of the world's financial assets are already moving, and they're moving fast. And here, Yanni, I want to draw on your amazing work with my colleague, George Serafin. The work that you and George and others in the field have done to advance ESG and to be clear about why they're so important is completely path-breaking. And let me just review why. You know, I sometimes joke, I did not understand that accountants hold up the world's civilization. I thought accountants were kind of boring. No, completely wrong. I took for granted financial accounts, which are now the absolute beating heart of capitalism, right? But 100 years ago, when P&G issued its annual report, it said, you know, our revenues are 20 million, our profits are 500,000. Stockholders wanting more are welcome to apply to our headquarters in Cincinnati in person. I mean, the financial accounts we take for granted that allow investors to invest in thousands of firms all over the world took 100 years to build. So ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics, are absolutely critical. They allow firms to communicate to investors what they're trying to do, and they allow investors to find the firms that are managing the disruption, that are taking the leap. But of course, it's a mess. I'm sorry, is that overly technical? ESG at the moment is in flux. There are all kinds of different metrics. Finding something that is auditable, replicable, and material in the sense that it really has a bearing on the firm's performance, that's super tough. In itself, it's a major disruption, right? Accounting is being disrupted. So I'm not worried. It's only a third of the world's invested capital that's on this wavelength. I think that's amazing. The fact that there are asset managers like Larry Fink or chief investment officers like Hiro Mizuno at the Japanese pension fund saying, we need ESG and we need it now, is incredibly powerful. And I think there's another aspect of finance I'd like to talk about if you're up for it, which is this idea of universal investors. Mm-hmm. The idea, and I can never decide if this is really creepy or really good news. I can never, 15 to 20 people between them control, you name the number, 40% of the world's assets. I mean, it is really creepy. And they, I think, are increasingly coming to realize that what we talk about as externalities are not externalities to them. If you run the Japanese pension fund, 1.6 trillion in assets, climate change is not something you can diversify away from. It's one of the most important risks to the value of your portfolio. Most of your money's in passive funds. You're not going to make money by getting out of Ford and getting into Toyota. You're going to make money by making sure the financial system doesn't crash. And we have the former governor of the Bank of England saying he thinks climate change presents a very significant risk of causing the next crash. We are living through a pandemic, a low probability risk that everyone said was out there, and now it's here. Climate change is going to be another major risk, and there's not going to be a vaccine, and we know it's coming. So maybe the big financial people will get together and say, we need to address these issues. They, in a sense, have the collective interest of the whole economy at heart. So yes, there's greenwashing. Yes, there are problems, but I think finance could play a major role in reimagining capitalism.
Absolutely. So universal ownership, as I'm sure you know, it's an issue that's been investigated a lot, especially in the finance literature, right? All these big questions of whether universal owners actually promote competition or actually do not. And I think the jury's still out, but as far as I know, I haven't seen, maybe I'm running, behind my finance literature reading list. I haven't seen much on universal ownership and environmental, social, and governance issues, right? Mm-hmm. So Rebecca, as you mentioned, these are quite powerful players in the global system, not just at the national, but quite at the global system. And theoretically, it makes sense because we're dealing with a massive public goods problem, a massive collective action problem, which is precisely what it is. So in your view then, given the power that they have, are you thinking about this more as self-regulation of these universal owners and in general the financial industry? Or do you see a combination of self-regulation with government regulation? And if I can add to that, these are global owners, right? So we need to talk about global institutions as well. So how do you see this sort of the governance, therefore, of the impact that the financial community can have on these issues?
So in my really utopian dreams, I see us managing to build global institutions that have some degree of democratic accountability, that are built up from democratically accountable national institutions. At the moment, those institutions are under enormous stress, and given that so many national institutions are under stress, I think right now we cannot look to those kind of global institutions, although of course they can be very helpful. The UN, institutions like the PRI are making a significant difference. But no, in the short term, I'm hoping for self-regulation. Self-regulation in finance, in the interests of the economy and the society as a whole at a global level. Now, Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for exploring when and where you see self-regulation. I think the good news is you do see it. It is possible, it is stable. My leading example here would be the International Chamber of Commerce, which is a completely voluntary self-regulatory body that essentially sets the rules for all of global trade and runs its own courts and adjudication procedures for enforcing those rules. So we have an example of how business can self-regulate at a global scale. And as I say, because finance is so concentrated, which is partly could be, I think they might self-regulate to address climate. I'm much less optimistic of their self-regulating to address inequality and social inclusion. I think they should, because I think inequality and social inclusion together pose a mortal threat to the long-term health of our society. And I don't think anyone should want to end up living in a walled compound with guards at the door and the hoi polloi outside. I don't think that's healthy for anyone. But will they do it? I don't know. And let's be clear, we have to keep the social and political pressure on. Why are so many firms moving? Because their employees have been insisting that they do. Why are so many firms moving? Because while very few customers will pay more for sustainable goods, they will switch brands. So I'm not saying that business can save the world. I'm not saying this is a done deal. But I think if we keep on the social and consumer pressure, business will move, everything we're talking about is happening. So yes, to answer your question, I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but I am hopeful.
Wonderful. That's a fantastic quote. I think I'm going to use it as well. So since we talked about self-regulation and regulation, Rebecca, and I'm cognizant that we need to switch to the Q&A as well, although I've been reading the questions, so some of them I have indirectly asked you as well. So let me talk about this issue. Politics is an area in which few academics dare approach unless you are a political scientist, right? Let alone a business school professor. It's a bit of a taboo subject. But you dare go there in your book, and very bravely so, right? A strong thesis of your book, I would say, is that, and some would maybe call this an oxymoron, is that business should lobby to get business out of politics, or at least money out of politics, right? And I understand the idea that you're suggesting is that business should not take an active stand on one particular policy, but essentially business should support the political process, right? And the civics of it all. Can you unpack that aspect to us? How do you envision this role of business and it's at the intersection or within politics to fix the system?
It's easiest to start by focusing at the local level. Many cities in the world have groups of business people that talk regularly with local politicians, governors, mayors, and talk about issues like the transportation system, the educational system, the healthcare system. And so we have a history at the local level, nearly everywhere, of business engaging with politicians in the interests of broadly the social good. Historically, when societies have broken, business associations have come to the table with representatives of employees and with government and sat down and said, well, this is not working. If you think about what happened after World War II in Germany, the country was in ruins. The German Business Association was tempted to go back to, we're in charge, we run everything. That's how they were running Germany. And could see that such a course would lead to social breakdown and probably take you nowhere economically. So there are these moments historically where business as a whole has realized that the system is in balance. And I don't say it in my book, but I believe, and coronavirus has really increased the strength of that belief, that we are approaching such a moment now, that our societies are cracking, that business has a strong self-interest, enlightened self-interest in addressing these issues. So while it sounds crazy, business should lobby to get money out of politics, it's happening. Business should attempt to fix the democracy. It's happening. We saw Twitter just today give its employees a day off to vote. It's a small move. It's a fundamental move. Just as business leaders are stepping up and saying it's unacceptable to discriminate against LGBTQX policies, and I think they played a role in the recent incredible Supreme Court ruling, which said, you know, you're right. So business should be stepping up when they see voter suppression, when they see gerrymandering, when they see an active attempt to subvert the democracy, and this is hard, but they should pull back their money. You know, what got me writing this in the first place was the fact that firms were pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into climate denialism and into climate denialist politicians. That felt to me morally completely unacceptable, but more importantly, it felt stupid. If we had addressed climate change 15 or 20 years ago, we would have it nailed by now at a cost of 2 or 3% of the economy. Slowing it down is going to cause untold harm on generations of people. So yes, it's a stretch, but I went there because, hey, the world's on fire. Gotta say it.
Precisely.
Gotta say what needs to happen.
Well, being at 31 degrees Celsius in London today, I can tell you that it feels very close to being on fire. But on a serious note, thank you, Rebecca. That was a great, I think, bridge into the questions, and literally the questions are pouring in. So I will try to share, to pose them to you in some sort of theme-like structure to make sure that we cover as many of them as possible. So I think some of the questions are, if we start with the last component, when we talk about politics and institutions, a number of our questions basically tell us that, look, you talk about global institutions, but there is an obvious gap between the Western world institutions and the institutions in developing countries. It's one thing to be a company in Denmark, as one of our participants said, and it's quite another to start this in Sierra Leone. So how do you see this gap playing out between Western world sort of institutions, more developed institutions, and perhaps in less developing countries? How do companies navigate, if you like, those institutional nuances when they try to have this sort of impact that you're describing?
We have some good research evidence suggesting that purpose-driven companies who hold themselves accountable using things like ESG metrics, so it's not just talk, it's the real thing, that these kinds of companies, when they engage in less developed regions, can make a positive difference, certainly on the industries in which they work with, but also perhaps more broadly on the governance. This is a tricky issue, right? Because you don't want business fixing government. That's, I'm saying, is a no-no. But perhaps you do want business standing up for democracy, for freedom of speech, for real data, for the independent judiciary. So one of my hopes is, as we move forward, the large global multinationals will begin carefully and appropriately and transparently to engage with local institutions and to be a positive ally in trying to develop what the development economists call inclusive institutions, institutions that can really raise the economy and society in a powerful way. That's my hope. Clearly, lots of other things need to happen. Clearly, issues vary enormously between different countries, but that's the general direction in which I hope we might move.
So I think we're getting a lot of questions related to COVID-19, Rebecca, perhaps as expected. And there are basically three issues here. So people are asking, look, we have seen governments respond in particular ways. And we've seen, the European Union is already arguing about the Green New Deal, whereas, well, let's say the less Green Deal of the US, it's also another quite, a $2 trillion fiscal package, right? So governments had adopted a set of reactions to COVID-19. Companies have, and as I often tell to my students as well, we are going through a period where literally the world is watching, right? You have Just Capital tracking corporate responses. You have True Value Labs. You have so many other companies that are paying very close attention to how companies are responding. And of course, there is the potentially behavioral changes that we as individuals are experiencing through the crisis. So given corporate responses, government responses, and impact of individuals, if you were to assess, to evaluate, take all of those things together, would you be more or less optimistic that indeed we can reimagine capitalism now that we have this crisis, which is a mini testing ground, if you like, about given all these responses? What would you say to that?
COVID-19 makes me more optimistic. It is a terrible event. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying. Millions of people have lost their jobs. firms are shuttering. Many of us, I think, deal with moments of despair and isolation. It's a really tough time. It's easy to see how things could get worse. It turns out, by the way, that humans are hardwired to focus on negative possibilities because those are the ones that ate you on the savannah. So we tend to focus on everything that can go wrong. That's who we are. But I actually think there's a silver lining here. COVID has highlighted the weaknesses of capitalism, like with an enormous spotlight. Suddenly, inequality is not just a word, it's essential workers who have to keep working because they don't have healthcare or savings. Suddenly, climate change is not just a mumble, it really makes it viscerally real. How many millions of people the burning of fossil fuels kills every year? Because suddenly you can see the mountains and your lungs feel clear. It has completely torpedoed the idea that free markets can work without government. I mean, like, wait a moment, government turns out to be really, really, really important and to be able to generate trillions of dollars, and you really hope you have a good one. So I think all that works for us. And I think there's another more subtle aspect, which is we've all been unsettled. We're all thinking about the world in a new way. When I talked about this work and this book 6 months ago, I would tiptoe up to the idea of systemic change and business needs to work on rebuilding democracy. I'd spend most of my time talking about climate change and you can make money focusing on climate change, because to do anything else, everybody would just like glaze over. That has changed. People want to talk about changing the system. They understand completely what I mean when I say we need a capable, democratically accountable government. So I hope COVID has a silver lining.
I'm personally, I mean, sad to say, but I'm not as optimistic, but you definitely increased my degree of optimism with that answer, Rebecca. Because if you do draw the parallels, you know, at least with COVID, we had public buy-in and understanding, and that when it comes to climate change, not only do we have to deal with the problem, but we have to deal with climate change denial and funding of pseudoscience and stuff like that. But perhaps this is a strong wake-up call for all of us about the challenges ahead. Now, a couple of the questions that came in relate to the theme we touched upon, which is this idea of the financial market. And people basically have questions about the specifics, but allow me to kind of bring them a bit, summarize them a bit. So the idea is, you know, should we demand more transparency from asset managers about their engagements? Should we demand more transparency about their proxy voting practices? In other words, what can we do to make essentially the investment community better stewards of capital, right? And I'm sure you're aware the UK has one of, if not the world leading stewardship code for the investment community. So what can we do to enhance, if you like, that sense of stewardship by the investment community?
Two things. First, we can insist on transparency. We want to see everything, or at least a summary. Who are you talking to? What are you talking about? How are you voting? Secondly, we can vote our dollars. Our personal savings should be in responsible funds. Again, or ESG-oriented investments. An enormous fraction of the world's wealth is about to change hands as an older generation dies and a younger generation inherits. Those of us who are fortunate enough to be in that generation, not me, my father went bankrupt, but those of us who are fortunate enough to be in that generation must insist. You know, as we talk about business doing the right thing, there is no substitute for businesses' customers insisting they do the right thing. So transparency and retail and pressure from asset owners.
Great. So I would like to ask you one more question, Rebecca. We didn't touch it through our conversation, but I think it's a fascinating one. And if only we had more time. Clearly, you are one of the world's not only leading researcher and voices on this issue, but one of the leading educators on these issues. So if you were to take a step back and reflect on what do you think is the role of business education then, and business schools perhaps, in terms of accelerating this saving of capitalism or this reimagining of capitalism. What could these educational institutions do in order to avoid the world on fire or put out the fire in that sense?
Yanni, you're super kind. I'm just a researcher and just a teacher. All of us are just individuals doing what we can. I talk in the book about the temptation to despair, to think that individuals can't make a difference. And I think one of the things we can do as educators is really double down on the idea that changing the entire structure of the world's economic system is going to take all of us, and all of us matter. So of course, I think MBA education is important. I taught my course Reimagining Capitalism because at Harvard we write cases, and I was hoping not only that it would make a difference to the students at Harvard, but to students at business schools across the country. But I'm so aware that there are hundreds of business schools moving in this direction, that there are thousands of academics like us trying to talk to their students about the business possibilities that exist, raising the question of cooperation as a way to deal with externalities, talking about the fact that a strong capitalism requires a strong government and a strong civil society. So at Harvard, we're definitely trying to make a difference. We have more than 300 cases on shared value. I was asked to take over the required course in leadership and corporate governance. And so we're opening all these questions with the students. What is the purpose of the corporation? We try hard not to tell them what we think. It's all about what do you think? And really opening the question, should you respond to these issues? You know, do this case study. Is this guy saving the world or has he lost his mind? I mean, you know, those are the kinds of cases we're trying to teach. But
while watching out of the window, typically.
While watching out the window. But more broadly, I want to just reflect on, you know, thank you, everyone who tuned in. We can all feel so small, particularly now when we're all shut away from each other. But we can change the firms we work at. So many of the stories about sustainability have the hero CEO, but in reality, many firms switch because someone on the ground said, you know, we could cut our waste in half and make money. We could raise how much we pay to our entry-level employees and they would be more productive and we would be better. We could recruit at different places and get more diverse employees. And by the way, diverse people are going to be half the workforce in 20 years, and we should start recruiting them because we're going to be selling to them too. So people can make a difference as employees. They can make a difference as customers. Where you spend your money makes a difference. As citizens, vote, organize. I have a friend who started a group called Mothers Out Front at her kitchen table. She says, you would not believe, Rebecca, 20 angry mothers talking about climate change that show up at the hearing after hearing and make a nuisance of themselves and have done the homework. We are passing legislation. And they're in 8 states. I mean, local groups, real organization, huge difference. And last but not least, yes, your own behavior is important. It's important because you want to be internally consistent. At least I do. I don't want to talk about this and then do egregiously stupid things. But because we know social behavior works that way. If you don't fly or you choose to fly less, your friends will fly less. The research is quite clear on this point. So there's lots that we can do. And let me close just saying one thing, Yanni, and then I will stop. I don't think this is a done deal. We may not succeed in stopping climate change fast enough to arrest serious damage, or in fixing inequality in our lifetime, or in solving the 100-year-old problem of racial inclusion. But that's not a reason not to try. I can promise you that working on these issues is a road to hope and to joy. It's super hard, but I meet the most amazing people. Thousands of people are trying to drive change. And that's where the future is. That's where our kids are going. We have to make this work.
Rebecca, that was a brilliant ending and a very heartfelt ending as well. So thank you so much for that. And allow me to say that it was truly an honor and a privilege to have you today and to talk about this book. The book is already out, and I would highly recommend to everyone to read it. And it's in addition to, of course, a great reading, I thought it was also a fantastic call to action, exactly what Rebecca just told us. And as you said, Rebecca, nobody's an extra in this fight. Nobody's an extra in this attempt to reimagine the system and hopefully put all of us on a path and a more sustainable and a more responsible future. So thank you so much again for sharing with us your views, your insights, your experience in this fast evolving, very hugely important topic. And I really hope that very soon, not only do we have you back, but we can be even more optimistic about not only how we put out the fire, but how do we rebuild after putting out the fire. So thank you so much again, Rebecca. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me here. I really enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.